Hey everybody, this is Kathy Rakowski of Trident Proposals, and I have with me here today Jeff Gonzalez. Jeff is a veteran entrepreneur who started a company based on the knowledge he learned in the military as a Navy SEAL. He got his first big work through contracts with the Department of Defense, but then worked to expand his business to other law enforcement agencies and civilian sector. His company, Trident Concepts, is a reality-based training company specializing in weapons, tactics, and demolitions to meet the evolving threat. Pretty cool, huh? Jeff's commitment to customer satisfaction and focus on networking helped Trident Concepts branch out faster and farther than many other small businesses. So Jeff, thanks a lot for joining us. I know there's a lot of vets out there that can really benefit from just learning about your story and your history.
Well, Kathy, thank you for having me. I'm excited about that, and anything I can do to help the guys and girls to try to just kind of streamline the process, I guess, avoid the pitfalls that I found myself into is always a plus.
That's awesome. So tell us a little bit about why did you decide to start a business when you got out of the Navy?
The funny thing about it was we wanted to try to establish some of our own milestones and our own kind of way of doing business. And that's really hard to do. I found that was kind of hard to do in certain institutions. We saw a need, we saw a problem, we felt like we could handle that problem, but we were running into so many, I wouldn't necessarily call them roadblocks, but just the wheels of progress were so slow to turn that we're like, okay, this is going to kill us. So we took a chance. We decided to go out on our own, and we turned out to be quite successful at it.
So I like that you say you started with a problem, like you saw something that needed to be solved. So who did you shop your solution around to? Like how did it go from just an idea to an actual contractor's work?
Well, as you know, within the contracting world, there are hundreds of different solicitations that come out. And what we did was we concentrated at what we were really good at, and we really focused on that. And when we found, one contract that really played to our strengths, that kind of helped us to continue to move in that direction. So it was kind of like, I wouldn't necessarily say like a series of dominoes, but it was, we sunk all of our effort. I mean, literally, that became our only reason for taking in air was that single contract. And once we did a really good job with that, I mean, number one, we learned a lot about it, but it also set us up for the future as far as how we wanted to progress into other contracts.
And when you initially got it, was it a large contract and were you a prime, or was it a smaller sort of sole source?
It was a small business set aside that we partnered up with some actual friends of ours within the industry. They're a giant corporation of sorts, so it was, again, right up our alley. We came in as a small business set aside, and we got to play ball with the heavy hitters right away. So that was very eye-opening for us.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. I really like that you teamed with a guy or a company that could back you up, so that way you could get your foot in the door, really start selling your services, because it's not until you've proven to a client that you can do the work that they're going to trust you with your own contracts and stuff down the road. So it's textbook perfect. So really nice.
Well, I don't know if we followed the textbook. If we did, we probably were jumping from chapter to chapter. But it just seemed, we actually were approached by that company. They had come to us when we were still kind of feeling our way through the contracts. They actually thought that we might be a good fit for them. And when we looked it over, I mean, it was a pretty extensive contract. When we looked it over, we're like, yeah, you're right. This would be a perfect fit. And it played to both of our strengths. Our strengths as the primary providers of the service, and theirs for organization and facilities and all the other nitnoids that go into the big logistical plan.
That's perfect. It's interesting. A lot of folks kind of forget that part of teaming with somebody is seeing where your strengths and weaknesses lie and where theirs lie. And if you're both playing the same strengths, then it's pointless. But if you fill each other's gaps, it's perfect.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Nice, awesome. So then tell me a little bit about how you went in there, you did a great, wonderful job. So then how did you get follow-on work? How did you expand?
Well, we continue to work within the solicitation world, and we took, again, we really narrowed our focus. We could have thrown out a huge net, but as a small business, it's time consuming to try to fill that void with all these other potential contracts that maybe you have a shot at, but you have to put so much effort into the proposal, to the submissions, to the monitoring. that it just became one of these things where we had to go through basically what we just called triage. We looked to see what worked really well. And we found a couple that we bid on. We unfortunately didn't win the bids on those, but I felt like we put a really strong proposal, and we lost to the incumbents, which is very common, unfortunately. An incumbent has a strong presence, so we had a good possible chance at it, but in the end, the incumbents won the contracts that we went after. So we realized that we were expending a lot of energy into that, but what it also come out of it was our reputation from the contract that we originally had, which was a repeat. We won the the rebid, if you will. The contract created a nice synergy with our reputation with other forces that we wanted to be partnering with. So while we didn't get it from the big government side of the house, we had smaller ad hoc contracts that came right at us. So it was nice because we also didn't have to go through quite the laborious process of bidding on those contracts. So we kind of bypassed it and went directly to the horse's mouth in a sense, which we never saw that coming. That was kind of out of the blue.
Wow, so you guys were open to all sorts of different options, which is why you were able to capitalize on it. What would you say were those contracts you're speaking about, these other ones, is that civilian side or that the not military side?
Well, it was still under the government side. It was still within the military, and that kind of, again, we had made some good inroads. The nice thing about working within the military is that when you work with a group, the members of that group, they move on to different commands, they move on to different organizations. They like what they saw, they like the interaction they had with them. So then when it comes to them being in positions where they can influence some new direction for training or for services, our name kind of kept popping up, and that was kind of again, it was word of mouth to some extent. And since we're so agile and we can pick up and go and move to their location and conduct the training pretty much wherever we need to go, it made for a really good footprint for us, and one that we kind of still actually, I wouldn't say we rely on, but we still facilitate.
I think you're glossing over the fact that you're out there hustling. You're out there telling the world about what you're doing, building your reputation, building your brand. What would you recommend to folks just starting to help build their brand, build their reputation in the marketplace?
Well, I'll tell you, probably the best thing we did was embrace the social media aspect. We didn't have, obviously, the marketing capital to really invest like a more traditional business might. So what we did was, and I didn't like the guerrilla marketing tactics that were out there. So what we wanted to try to do was we wanted to sell the fact that our services are a premium service. And what we did was we started to create a following within our kind of blog sphere, where folks we like to add value to anything that we do. So a lot of the blogs were coming out and just they prompted thought, they questioned existing philosophies, they made folks kind of start to address these issues. And while we may not have seen some of the return as far as training or contracts or any of that, the fact that we were influencing change through that was huge. Honestly, I kind of did it I don't know, I was venting one day. I was just kind of upset about one thing or another, and I just went to the keyboard, and the next thing I know, we got a lot of positive feedback from that, because it was concepts that other people were thinking as well. So then we started to experiment with it, and then before we knew it, we were doing daily blogs, and it's been incredibly successful. It's definitely gotten the word out in the manner that we wanted to get it out, as a premium provider of services and the value that we add. So that, I think, was a big thing. And it was obviously something that I really didn't know anything about. I mean, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to, socialize on Facebook or Twitter or Skype or any of those things. So it was definitely a learning curve for us. So it didn't come easy, but I'm glad we did it, because it really has paid off.
Wow. And who's your target audience for blog? Is it the operator, the guy that would need the training, or is it? I mean, it's probably not the contracting officers.
Well, you're right. It's probably not the contracting officers, but the nice thing about it is that what I can remember from my active duty days was when we put out bids, a lot of times there was still a tremendous amount of influence in those bids from the operator side of the house. So by maintaining the connection with the operators, they would eventually go back to the contractors and say, okay, we need to reword it so we can get this, or we want to look in this direction. So they were able to kind of nudge the contractors to go in the direction that they wanted, even though there might have been some, some restrictions or, limited pathways to do it. But the blogs, I think, have transcended the various kind of like we have three different clients, if you will. We have the government side of the house, we have the law enforcement side of the house, and then we have the private, the private citizenry. And we've kind of tried to not necessarily target one in particular. We've kind of kept the subjects to where they're valuable to anybody, and we also try to keep everybody interested in them. So we try not to go down one direction that kind of alienates the other groups. So it's been a challenge in a sense, but the nice thing about it is that we've kind of created our own formulas for how we do it. A lot of times we're either talking about current events, or other times we're talking about lessons learned, or other times we're talking about new training philosophies and doctrines. So and while it may not be applicable to maybe the law enforcement officer, it's still interesting enough to where they want to participate. And then maybe down the road they're like, hey, I remember reading something about this where we've reached that crossroads where now we need to consider this. Perfect. So they have a resource to go to.
Wow, that's awesome. And you bring up a really good point that I think folks forget. Even in blogging and social media, whatever it is, you're still first providing value, which is what builds the brand. It's not just talking at them. It's giving them something that they can action on, that they really think about, get their teeth into.
It was. And I always, the value is in the form of education. We are trying to continue to educate outside of our classroom setting through the blog spheres, through the social medias. And our interest is in whether or not we receive a contract. Our interest is trying to better and improve everybody's outlook or perspective, or whatever it might take to help them improve.
Jeff, that's such a unique way to go about building a brand. I really like it, because most folks, they're just hitting the pavement and getting out to talk folks, whereas you're building your image, which
Thanks.
is neat. So to kind of switch topics for you, along the way of building a business and getting more contracts and everything, what do you wish that somebody had told you that would have saved you a lot of pain?
Whew. Wow, there's a lot. I think probably the best thing would have been a better understanding of the process. Because there are strict, if you're not part of a larger group that has the contract specialist that knows how to write the proposals, that knows how to format those proposals, that knows how to go about the presentation of those proposals, I think that was a huge learning curve for us. We really found ourselves in the deep end of the pool really quick, particularly with that first contract, because it was a very complex one. And obviously, it just took us researching. It took us picking up the phone and calling. It took a few trial submissions to kind of figure out what we needed. But because we didn't have our own contract specialist, we were kind of in uncharted territories for us. So it would be nice to see, and there might be these. I just haven't looked at them in a while, but it would probably be really nice for somebody that's getting into the contract world to have, maybe not an intimate knowledge in the process, but just kind of knowing how the game is played. I think that's really huge, because we found out kind of the hard way that, wow, there's just so much process. There's so many steps and layers and coming back and checks and balances and all these other things that it made it really, at first it made it really overwhelming, but then we just kind of, sunk our teeth into one little thing at a time, and we eventually, tackled all of them.
That's awesome. The process one rings true for almost every veteran I've spoken to about any of this type of stuff. And we put together an ebook recently just called The Veteran Startup Strategy to kind of walk folks through that process.
Oh, that's awesome. God, where was that 7 years ago?
Well, it's interesting because it turns out most of the steps, it's not like getting your stuff into the government database, making sure you're in SAMs. It's do exactly what you are doing, Jeff. It's get out there and talk to people. It's get out there and just hustle and figure it out and do your research, do your homework. And just knowing where to do your homework can be a big help in some cases.
Totally, I could see that.
Awesome. So another sort of switch topic, because one of the things that you said before is you are really big on making sure you're delivering them the best value that they can have, because ultimately what you're doing is saving lives. So why and how customer satisfaction, how do you make sure that you are doing the best you can?
I think there's probably three things that you have to really do. You have to be able to communicate well, and you have to understand the expectations of the customer. And that's what I talked about, where if you don't play to your strengths and you don't understand the expectations, then you're eventually going to find yourself in some muddy waters. Somebody's going to be unhappy because either you're not doing what you thought you should be doing, or they're not getting what they thought they should be getting. So those two kind of go hand in hand. And then once you have that, once you are able to communicate and get those expectations, the next thing is the monitoring and the ability to pass that feedback to the higher up. So we're really big on standards. And so once we had an understanding through the communication of what they expected, we created standards that allowed us to gauge the progress. And so we could speak with authority and saying, okay, Class A did great. They met these standards. They're wherever they are in the 70, 80 percentile. Class B came through a month later, not so much. Here's their weak areas. Here's where we observe them struggling, and here's where we observe them doing well. That was a type of feedback that we felt was really, really valuable. It wasn't always well received by the end users, but by the higher ups, the value that they got from that, like, holy cow, yeah, I can actually touch my results. I can, print them out on a paper and actually look and say, wow, this is hard to argue with, because there's the emotional side of, I want to do well, but then there's the physical side of I am doing well, and sometimes you might feel like you're doing well, but the reality is that you're not. So it was something that I don't think a lot of folks had been exposed to, the standards and whatnot. But for us, it was such a huge way for us to, because the other thing is that we were working with some guys, that are at the tip of the spear. I mean, that whole program was for the SOCOM community. So sometimes it's difficult to affect change without being able to physically show the need for change. When we had collected after over 2 years of statistics, and then we could go back to a newer element and say, hey, you're not performing to the same level as your peers that have come through this program before. That would get their attention, and that would sometimes kind of lower some obstacles to learning and to improving that had been in place before. So it wasn't like, hey, this is us talking. This is your own guys talking, saying, hey, we did better than you, and here's the numbers that prove it, type thing.
So you essentially said, the only way to make sure I satisfy my customer is to design metrics so that they can actually measure. Because a lot of the times folks forget that performance is also measuring performance, so that you can, if the customer's like, oh, I don't know if I got everything out of it, you're like, no, look, I told you I would do these 7 things. Here's how I stacked up against each one of them.
Exactly.
And also I think people see customer satisfaction as a one-way street. How do you feel about it? But instead, you took it and made it a two-way street, and you're telling them how they are satisfied.
Well, and it was one of those things where you're right, because customer satisfaction was one of those things where, okay, we could play to the end users that we're seeing on a regular basis, or we can address the issue at like a larger point of view. Like we wanted the commanders to come back and say, from wow, this affected so much. This was look at what we're looking at here. So that was the satisfaction that we were looking at. Granted, it may not have had, like, everybody may not have been happy with their performance because of one thing or another. But I think the important thing was, like you said, these guys are having to go into harm's way. So it's very important from us, from an integrity point of view, that we do the very best that we could. And we felt keeping to those kind of standards allowed us to do the very best that we could and repeat that from one class to the next. So consistency was key. We wanted to be able to do that so that everybody got the same amount of investment in what we were trying to sell them.
Wow. And you also, something that a lot of folks overlook, they focus on the guy that they're actually training, right? Well, if his boss, the purchaser, essentially, if mom's not happy, the check signer, then you aren't going to get rehired.
Yeah. Well, that was the other thing too. I mean, we knew that it was important for us. But the other thing too that was important for us is, again, we would like to see a rehire or another contract come down the road. That's always important to us. But the other thing too was a lot of times these guys are taking a risk in some of these contracts. You know, the commander is taking a risk investing that much capital, that much revenue. You know, their budgets are shrinking, so they have to be able to justify it sometimes. So I think a lot of times for them to sit back and have that kind of head nod saying, that was money well spent because look at what I got for this. And to give them that warm and fuzzy, that was important, I think. Now, we still wanted to work with the end users and to keep them happy as well. But, you know, unfortunately, if the commanders don't take those risks to bring about that type of training from the smaller business perspective, then, you know, then we're kind of missing the boat there. So that was really important to us. And that was a strategy that, you know, we hadn't really thought about helping, how it could help everybody else in the small business sectors. But in the end, by doing that, I think it gives those commanders that confidence to go out and take a risk with a small business that may not have the big name that they've heard all the time, but yet still get the value from their net results or from what they were looking for.
Well, that's pretty awesome. I want to follow up on something you said earlier. You made a really good point about making sure you understand your customers' requirements.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? Like, how do you initially establish that?
Well, a lot of times, you know, a lot of times you're giving like your task listings. Like, okay, this, you know, we had 18 task listings. We were responsible for every contract that we provided, and you know, we had to literally go and talk. And the hard part about it was that sometimes it was different from each class, so we did have to have some flexibility. But it was challenging because you do have to communicate with them. You have to have the ability to interpret what it is that they're wanting, they're asking for, and then be, you know, and again, we felt this was a strong suit for us, so we were able to flex a little bit, maybe go heavy on this sector, maybe go a little bit lighter on this sector, but yet they're still getting what we agreed to by the contract, by the letter of the law, if you will.
Gotcha. And in sort of practice, does that look like conversations with the client, the operator? Like, who exactly are you talking to?
Well, a lot of times we talked directly to the contract officer, but we had such a good relationship with the contract officer, who was a former end user previously, that he would take our request and send them to, you know, the teams and to the different people that were making the decision makers at that point. So we could send a request in saying, hey, can you give us clarification on what exactly you mean by this? And we would get a response back that gave us the information that we were looking for. So we were at least on the same sheet of music. We understood the client's needs. I mean, some of it was pretty simple, but other times we just wanted to make sure that we understood it clearly. Because again, what we didn't want to do was come game time, oh, wait a minute, this means this to you because it means this to us, and have that kind of like that misunderstanding.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, when people say things and people put things out, we've seen a lot of the times in the statement of works and stuff, it goes through so many different levels. By the time it gets to you, it's very different from what the guy thought was asking for in the beginning.
Oh, yeah. And that was one of the things that we recognized. You could tell, being an end user ourselves, we could kind of see kind of like the contract language and kind of read between the lines. But that's why it was so important for us to get the clarification from the end users as to exactly what they wanted and what they needed.
Got it. That's pretty awesome. And here's a question for you. So when it comes to these contracts and these big statement of works that they put out, a lot of the times, if you're in there talking to the folks, you can kind of shape what goes in there. So for instance, if they see in your blog you have this new type of training, then they're like, oh, I want that. I'm going to tuck that in there. Mm-hmm. What other ways have you been successful in getting like new innovations or types of training that you want to do put into these contracts?
A lot of times it's about understanding the customer. So once, you know, we would go through a litany of assessments, and then we would go right into the agreed work that we had to do. But we would find ways to challenge them. And we, you know, through our assessments, we might be able to find, okay, this particular class, maybe they're not good at this skill. They're good at all these other skills. So we have a way to kind of, it might step outside the statement of work a little bit, but it shows them, you know, we can kind of help them to see, okay, here's a way to improve in that area. So by understanding where they were weak and maybe not being able to do as much work as we wanted because of the statement of work, we could show them ways that we do it In other words, it wasn't like we were completely going against the statement of work, but we would go out there and we would show, we had enough of our staff guys out there that I could show through my own staff guys how we do it. And then they could even take that back for their own, kind of like professional development on their own, or they could circle back to us and ask, hey, can you put something like that together? And that did happen. We had that happen with us. A lot of our classes that we've brought from the government military side of the house that we brought into the law enforcement sectors were almost a direct result of that kind of that maturation cycle, where all of a sudden an end user would find out about that and they would want us to bring that service to them. So it may not have been the original customer, but somehow or another the word got out and we got the request to come in and do that same program, but this time it was a completely different client. It was outside of the government realm and inside the law enforcement realm.
Speaking of the law enforcement realm, are there any challenges that are really different than going after a defense type of contract? Like, what would people need to look out in that area?
Well, we have been fairly successful on the law enforcement side, but really the big players on the law enforcement side still kind of fall underneath the government. You're looking at the federal side of the house, and they have, while they're different, there's some similarities, but the differences are kind of they're significant to where you have to really kind of work. You have to really work with them, but we found that there was equal success to be had in the law enforcement section, and we found that there was not more work, but I would say that we found more opportunity to do different type of work that we wanted to do. So the contracts were very limited in scope. We could only we had to stay within the left and right limits. But when we started to work with the law enforcement sectors, they gave us a lot greater latitude for us to deviate from like an initial conversation. We start working with the customer, we start to get to know them, we recognize, hey, you know what, that might have been your initial request to do this, but based off of what we're seeing and based off of what I think we can do for you, we should probably go in this direction. And they're very open to that a lot of times. Sometimes not, but I was really surprised because they were much more open to changing, and it wasn't quite like changing the wheels on the bus on the government side. It was a little bit easier to facilitate that.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Now you talk about having more room to grow your sort of service offerings to these different clients.
Right.
How does that process look for you? Is that hiring new instructors, or is that just applying more brain power? And
a little bit of both, actually. We are a small company, so we have to maintain. I prefer to maintain a smaller footprint for a lot of reasons, but it does pose a challenge. We're very lucky. We have some incredible guys that work with us that they're experts in their own rights. They bring so much to the table for us. But yet in the end, it really is. It's the gray matter that really kind of gets it all going. That gets us to the door. After the gray matter to the door scenario, then it's really it's our staff working closely with the end user to try to get it done.
Wow, were there any sort of problems or issues you ran into in developing training type stuff or developing any new service offerings? Were there any things people should watch out for?
Ooh. Well, probably the one thing that we ran into, and I say this because it bothered me, because from an integrity point of view, we were concerned about what was happening here. But we ran into a few on the government side that they didn't know what they didn't know, and that was tough. As a subject matter expert, we're trying to help them to see these things. And we were concerned because these were soft skill individuals that were marrying up with my own teammates downrange. So I had a very the importance of making sure that we did the best job, because they were going to be commingling with my former community, was very important. And so we really struggled with that, because what we found was, this was where we kind of realized this is not the type of contract that we want to be involved in, because there's too much, it's too difficult to try to get them to recognize that maybe what you want isn't what you really need. And that was tough, and that was hard, and that's why we were happy to step away from that, because again, I don't want to spin our wheels and waste our resources working with an organization that is just struggling to kind of see what we see. And so that was a tough one for us. because you never want to say no. You never want to say you can't do this. You never want to kind of walk in there and say, we're sorry, we're going to kind of cut our losses. That can have a negative ripple effect. But I think it's even worse if you try to continue to push, even though there's going to be there's going to be problems down the road. So for us, it just made more sense to finish the work we started with them, but then to kind of politely move in a different direction and just kind of let them kind of do their own thing from there.
So a no can be just as strategic as a yes.
Absolutely. And here's the thing too. One of the best advices that I can give, because the small business set-asides, guys that want to try to get into them, they'll almost do anything to try to get in there. They'll say yes when they probably really should say no. And that's the hard part, is that the contracts are starting to slow down a little bit. It's starting to become more competitive again, which it always should be. And the problem that I run into is I know some of these organizations, and I'm like, okay, they clearly do not have the skill sets to do that, but they're still going to go pursue it, and then they're going to solve the problem after they win the contract. And it's kind of an ass backwards template, but we see that happen a lot, and it's unfortunate, but and it doesn't always happen, because a lot of times the end users do their due diligence to make sure that things are where they should be, but I'm surprised that more organizations don't say no when they should.
Interesting. And it seems like, so that's exactly the model you did not follow, which is what worked so well for you. Because you didn't stretch too far, you stayed in your niche, and you could develop a name there, you were far more successful otherwise.
I think so. I think it worked out. I mean, you never want to say no, but in the end, looking back at it, it was the right thing.
Well, and you were very creative with your yeses. So you not only, like, you were in a niche, yes, but then you expanded that niche to different people that could use that same skill set, rather than saying, yes, we can do all training for absolutely everybody.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that was another thing too. That just happened. It just seemed like that was the right thing to do. Like, we tried to apply not just common sense, but we try to apply. We always try to keep the end user in mind, and we always try to put ourselves in their shoes, and just kind of keep that in the back of our minds.
Nice. So now that you're a little bit larger than you were when you started, and your sort of major concerns and sort of issues are different, what are the big things that you're worried about now, and what are you doing to kind of mitigate those concerns?
Well, the big thing is, we're a small company, and we want to stay that way. So the biggest problem is going head to head with the larger companies, and trying to continue to stay competitive in that sense. And it's hard. It's not an easy arena to be in, but it's one that we're happy to be in, because we'll eventually find, we're very strategic about who we want to contract with. That's the other thing. We're smart about where we want to go with that. So that's helped us a little bit. I mean, we would like to see more contracts, of course, but that could also be, that could be a bad thing, in the sense that the contracts may not play to our strengths. They may wear down our resources. They may keep us from continuing to be cutting edge, which is what we try to do. We try to stay on the top of things. We try to maintain that agility and that forward-leaning kind of concept. And so sometimes if we go in some different directions, it can actually bog us down to the point where, okay, that contract may have been good for 1 or 2 years, but then after we're done with it, we lost all of our forward momentum as an entity, because all of our guys still try to work very hard to maintain that cutting edge. So all of a sudden we find ourselves 2 years later, wow, we're stagnant, and we never want to be stagnant.
Gotcha. Wow, I like the way you're so strategic about your decisions. You're not just taking whatever comes. You do to a certain extent, but you also sort of plan it out, which is important.
There is some sort of method to my madness. I don't always know it. Sometimes I'm not, sometimes I don't want to, I obviously have made some bad choices, some poor choices, but at the same time, those choices have led us to creating a model that works for us.
That's awesome. Jeff, this has been really amazing, and I'd like, if you could just give 3 pieces of advice to veterans out there looking at starting a business, what would those 3 things be?
Play to your strengths. Don't be hesitant to get in the arena with the bigger companies and duke it out with them. If you have a solid product, the actual contractors will recognize that, and then recognize, create some sort of integrity within your business model that you can stay firm on. Because I think as soon as we, if guys can maintain that mindset of hey, these are our business standards, this is the integrity that we're going to stick to, you will find that it may be rough at first, but you're going to be so much better off for it down the road from a reputation point of view, from your own, your own happiness or your own, what you value as far as you being successful. All of that will fall into place if you can maintain that.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Is there anything that folks should know about Trident specifically, or how they can get a hold of you if they want your services?
Absolutely. I mean, they can always visit our website, tridentconcepts.com. They can follow us on all this, we're on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all those other things. So they can certainly reach out to us. And if they wanted to get in touch with me personally, they can shoot me an email at Gonzalez at tridentconcepts.com.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jeff.
My pleasure, Kathy.